you everyone for being here for our final day of panels. We're very excited to kick off our last day with our third plenary talk. I'm delighted to introduce Spencer Weart. He is a historian of science, the former director of the Center for History of Physics of the American Institute of Physics. He holds a PhD in physics and astrophysics, and he is the author of a long list of books, of which I will just mention a few. Never at War, Why Democracies Will Not Fight One Another, The Rise of Nuclear Fear, and he has also written extensively on global warming, including the highly influential The Discovery of Global Warming. He is one of the foremost experts on the history of climate science, the history of nuclear power, and the controversies associated with it. Also with us today, Cutler Cleveland from BU. He is professor of Earth and Environment, specializing in questions of energy, climate change, and sustainability. But to not hold the floor any longer, with no further ado, Spencer, I hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks. Let me try sharing my screen here. As you have just heard, I began my career as a physicist. So let me begin with a bit of physics. Currently, there is an energy imbalance on our planet. We are receiving about 1 watt per square meter more energy than we radiate out because the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are blocking some of the radiation going on. 1 watt per square meter, if, as I had expected, we were meeting in a small conference room, I'd say that was like we had a 100-watt bulb burning in here, adding its heat day and night. And this is happening over the entire surface of the Earth. If humanity shut down now and stopped emitting greenhouse gases, this would still be there. The greenhouse gases linger for hundreds and thousands of years. So they would stay until the Earth was radiating out enough energy and heated up enough to radiate out enough energy to be in balance. That's probably about another 0.5 degrees above where we are now, 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. In the Paris Agreement, nations promised to halt global warming below 2 degrees above pre-industrial, but their current policies will not do that. Stopping at 2 degrees would require massive changes starting right now. Otherwise, we are headed for 3 degrees. The planet at 3 degrees is one with weather disasters every week, massive crop failures, hundreds of millions of refugees from areas that are basically no longer habitable. And this will happen by the time my little grandson reaches my age. So I could show you lots of pictures of that, but I thought you might be amused by Thomas Cole's 19th century painting of the destruction of a civilization. Now, I agree with Michael Bess, who spoke the other day, that climate change can be a force to unify the world, but that is not the only possibility and maybe not the most likely one. If catastrophes do push everyone to act, will they act democratically? I think it's at least likely that we will have authoritarian governments. We will have many failed states. We will have dictators with nuclear weapons and drone armies. On the other hand, some elites gain wealth and power from disasters. Goldman earnings soar 93% amid the pandemic recession. Even though the most powerful are profiting from the coronavirus, everyone else will lose in climate disasters, and there will be a vastly increased inequality. So democracy might not survive 3 degrees of global warming. Talk about the survival of democracy. We're talking about an external threat. So what shall we do? Okay, so now the first section of my paper, the global commons. The atmosphere, widely recognized as being a kind of a commons, formally speaking, a common pool resource. There are no restrictions to use of this resource. Anyone can dump into the atmosphere. This is the familiar model of the Old English commons, wherein Garrett Harding's classic explanation of the tragedy of the commons. Anyone can add a cow, and eventually there's so much cows that what nobody wanted, it gets grazed down to nothing. This Harding proposed to solve the problem of the commons. This is called the problem of free riders. Everybody is a free rider can add a cow without a penalty. Free rider problem is to be solved by privatization. You wall it off, you sell pieces off, and presumably everybody will take care of it, take care of their own land because now they have ownership of it. This is the neoliberal ideal. It actually happened to the commons. It was called the enclosure movement, and of course, it was a complete disaster for the common people. The privatization has its own problem, not free riders, but rent seekers. people who find that they can extract rent from ownership of land, for example, without doing any work. So the ultimate end of neoliberalism, I would propose, is the aristocracy of 17th century Spain or the aristocracy of 19th century Russia, which lived lives of complete idleness in the capital cities because they, without doing a lick of work, because they extracted so much wealth from their rents that they didn't give a hang whether the peasantry was sunk in ignorance and poverty. Now, this did not have to happen. The Old English commons before enclosure functioned very well. It was managed in a way that avoided both free riders and rent seekers, and there have been many other successful commons, forests, fisheries, aquifers, and so forth. This was all studied by Eleanor Ostrom, who is here receiving the Nobel Prize in economics for her work and the work of her students and colleagues on commons, and they derived a number of rules for a successful commons management, of which a couple are particularly relevant here. One of Ostrom's rules: most individuals affected by a resource regime are authorized to participate in making and modifying its rules. Who are the people who use the commons and must govern the commons? Well, that has already been decided. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change says that the authorized participants are nation states, which are supposed to represent the actual polluters, users of the commons, that is to say, us. Now, the Paris Agreement was sadly inadequate, and so after that, there's been much talk of subnational entities and a broader democratization, like the groups of cities that Sheila Foster talked about earlier. This may become important, but right now, in fact, only nation states are able to negotiate the global commons, and so we will focus on them. The great problem of the commons, of course, is free riders. What about India? How do we stop India from building more and more coal plants? Well, only nation states can put effective pressure on other nations. This is another rule. There are sanctions. Sanctions for rule violations start very low. They become stronger if a user repeatedly violates a rule. Right now, in fact, sanctions are very low. The only sanction we have is criticism, shaming, either from other nations or from domestic audiences. There is talk eventually of carbon border taxes, and I'll say more on this later. If things really get bad, then nations may take on geoengineering on their own, and ultimately military force. One can imagine China in great straits bombing India's coal plants and that kind of thing. Not entirely unreasonable. So we're talking now about interactions between states, and the most fundamentals are, of course, revealed in the extreme case of war or peace. So section on war, peace, and political culture. This, as was mentioned, has to do with my very extensive research in the entire history of wars between all kinds of states. And I found what people had sort of suspected. Democracies have essentially never made war on their own kind. This has been vaguely understood for centuries. There might be some kind of democratic peace. But as I and a few others who were working at the same time found, this held universally, clear back to ancient Greece. They say history is not a science, everything is contingent, but this is in fact an iron law of history. Now, there's another interesting thing here, the oligarchic republics. They're almost unknown in the 20th century, so people tend to overlook them, but they give us great clues for understanding the forces in international relations. An oligarchic republic, and there were hundreds of them in ancient Greece, medieval Italy, early modern Germany, and some other places. In these, there is only a small minority that has voting rights. The characteristic of an oligarchy is a clear division between the minority of citizens and the majority, often the great majority, of the peasantry and the working people who are simply held down by force. Now, a remarkable fact that oligarchic republics hardly ever made war on their own kind. The few exceptions are trivial. So it's essentially another law of history. Now, other government combinations made war repeatedly. Oligarchies did fight democracies. The autocratic states, popes, kings, everybody, indiscriminately and promiscuously fought everybody. The only explanation that really works is an explanation in terms of political culture, by which one means the broadly shared beliefs, attitudes, practices, norms, when people face decisions of policy and power. Now, political leaders were raised in particular ways and norms, with careers made negotiating with others like themselves, naturally try the same thing abroad. Their diplomacy works as if they're dealing with their own kind at home. The leaders of republics do not use violence against their peers, either at home or abroad. They argue and compromise. This fails with autocrats, as Chamberlain thought that Hitler could be dealt with like a British parliamentarian. He could not. It also fails between oligarchies and democracies because the oligarchs' whole political system is based on keeping the masses down by violence. So what is the political culture of republics, whether a small oligarchic minority or full democracy? Political scientists have lists. These are some of the common elements: rule of law, equal rights under the law, freedom of speech, very important, information exchange is critical, tolerance of dissent, and in particular, nonviolent conflict. We make decisions not by force, but by majority vote. These are obviously things that are crucial for peace abroad. The old German republics had a good way of expressing this. The citizen body would gather together in the cathedral, so you can see it was quite a small citizen body every year, and they would swear allegiance to das Recht, a wonderful German word. It means the law, it means the laws, it also means the right thing. Essentially, they were swearing obedience to their political culture. Now, in this list, there are other elements that political scientists find, but that are often overlooked. I call them the foundation in the sense that they are fundamental, but also like a foundation, mostly hidden. One of these is decisions made by consensus. If you get to the point of voting, it's already a bit late in the game. Most of the decisions in a well-functioning republic are made almost with people not even being aware that the decisions have been made hardly by consensus. And as Ostrom put it when she was talking about governance of the commons, consensus is defined by the absence of reasonable objections. Debate continues until everyone agrees that the proposal is good enough, even if many or maybe nobody fully agrees with all of it. And the other thing that's often overlooked but fundamental is that people work for the common good. And the German burghers had this too. They would swear allegiance not only to das Recht, but to the common weal, the common good, the commonwealth, the community, the Gemeinschaft. Commitment to the community is just essential. So these are the elements of Republican political culture. And as I have already kind of hinted, these are also essential for effective commons management. Republican principles, in particular, commitment to consensus and to the common good, align with Ostrom's norms and procedures that are necessary for successfully managing a commons. I should add that an international regime governed by nation states looks more like an oligarchic than a democratic republic. The mass of people have no direct vote. In fact, the people who are most affected, which is the global poor and future generations, do not even have a voice. Fortunately, democracy is not essential for commons management. In the old English commons, the most refractory disputes were ultimately settled in a court of law with trial by jury. A few top landowners and elite reaching a consensus. That's trial by jury, consensus. Now, nation states can work together as a governing elite. Now let us turn to the opposite pole from war, next section, international regimes and alliances. Well, republicans form durable alliances, another law of history. Really, only republics form durable alliances. The explanation is, again, political culture. Republican political culture makes it easy to form peaceful coalitions with one's own kind to address common problems. The European Union, the United States itself, as the name implies, NATO, oligarchies also form alliances. The Hanseatic League, for example, this is the seal of the Hanseatic League. Two merchant adventurers on a ship debating what their common rules will be, forming something like the Mayflower Compact that is basic to American ideology. Indeed, essentially all durable international regimes and organizations were initiated by groups of republics. I think the earliest was the Universal Postal Union, founded in Bern, a good oligarchic republic, in 1874, and the Red Cross. Many international regimes now, mostly under the wing of the United Nations, which itself, as we heard the other day, was created by democracies. Now, authoritarian states do join international regimes and even military alliances when it is their interest. However reluctantly, and you will notice who is the odd man out here, however reluctantly they go along with the Republican norms of the alliance or the regime. On their own, dictators have never made stable alliances with one another. In famous cases, military alliances of kings that broke up right in the middle of a war. But in desperate circumstances, everyone can work together, and climate change does pose an existential threat to nations, worse than the Nazis. As Michael Bess argued the other day, this campaign to reverse global warming could plausibly unite mankind, humankind. As in the Second World War, each fights the enemy on their own front and sends information and war material to the Allies. Now, the climate problem requires more than sending tanks. We will need the refined and the durable methods of commons management. We'll need to get all the allies to follow Republican norms and procedures within the international climate regime, if nowhere else. So to manage the global commons, we must have a Republican political culture in many of the leading nations, at least enough of the main nations to keep the violent habits of the autocracies in check. Unfortunately, just now, as we turn to the democracies to establish Republican ideals in climate negotiations, these are eroding within many democracies. Deep divisions threaten the norms of consensus and even the norm of nonviolence. We must find a way to get citizens together to mobilize the nation to act on climate. So, next section, uniting the nation states to act on climate. The problem, of course, is the people are retreating into tribal subgroups, a decay of the community spirit. A good case is the gas taxes that provoked the Yellow Vest revolt in France. People didn't want to pay a gas tax for the sake of reducing global warming. People won't do much to help the homeless families of Bangladesh, especially the homeless families of Bangladesh 50 years from now. After all, we do little to help our own poor right now. And yet we do need people to make sacrifices for the sake of controlling the climate. Everyone's consumption of carbon must start to drop very quickly. So what is it that can possibly motivate people to accept sacrifices for the common good? Well, let us consider a farm boy in 1941 that hears that Pearl Harbor has been bombed and rushes to volunteer to join the army. For the sake of a place he never heard of in a tropical island 5,000 miles away. This, of course, is the force we've been talking about already quite a bit here, nationalism. It gets people to vote, to pay taxes, to charge into gunfire. Now, I am following here, Internalizing Cleveland has a good book that argues that nationalism can rally citizens to fight climate change as an existential threat to their country. Now, I'm calling it nationalism in the positive sense some of our speakers have used. Of course, nationalism is despicable. It has tortured Europe with wars for centuries. It is the main support of dictators like Putin and Xi in China. But liberal Democrats will only hurt themselves by disdaining feelings that are held by the majority of their fellow citizens. And to confront the climate emergency, it is necessary to rally a large majority. Liberals must find common ground with the right, or at least the moderate right. So we have to accept that there is an element of chauvinism, which is an exclusion, that we are better than everybody else, but cover it up as much as possible with patriotism, which is the community feeling. We need to move the conversation towards this ideal, but without denying or disparaging the feelings that do find expression in chauvinism. I think Yasha Monk explained this well, and I won't repeat it. We have to accept and support and welcome this nationalism, even in its less desirable aspects. Because wide support is necessary for action, we need the consensus, a joint effort to save our country, to save our commonwealth, their common good. Now, of course, besides nationalism, other things do motivate people to act on climate change. Many are not indifferent to the suffering facing the populations of impacted regions, the disadvantaged at home. Many are concerned for posterity, for the well-being of their own grandchildren, perhaps all future generations. Most upsetting for some is the despoliation of nature, and I have to say, this is the deepest source of my own climate grief. When I was a young and vigorous man of 65, I was backpacking in the Wind River Range, very beautiful mountains. I took this photograph. The trees in the foreground here are dead. They have been killed by bark beetles, no longer controlled by cold enough winters, and they are ravaging the entire American West. It is extremely saddening. Now, up to now, these are the motives that have mostly been invoked to get climate action, and they have not been enough. We should, of course, continue to talk about the global poor, our grandchildren, and nature, but many citizens will find nationalism, or patriotism, if you will, more meaningful. Now, again, the classic motivation to common action is a common threat. And in fact, for decades now, the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency have recognized that climate change is a threat to national security, eventually as bad as nuclear war. So we can frame this as a fight for national survival, survival of the heritage of those before us that we are duty bound to preserve and pass on. survival of our country's customs and ideals, survival of our very landscapes. So the left, however, must make, as I say, concessions in order to make common cause with the moderate right. For example, we need to back off from identity politics where it becomes attacking and divisive. We've heard about this already. If you're an American, you start by embracing your primary identity as American and work out from there to other identities. The nation state is defined by its borders, and we must accept that we cannot be liberal about our borders. In fact, as the future comes down, this is just going to become a practical matter. It will be impossible to take in more than a very small fraction of the many, many refugees that will be coming from foreign climate disasters. Have a hard enough time accommodating our own internal climate refugees. The other main use of borders is in trade, and again, liberals must make concessions about free trade. In fact, it is helpful here to allow a bit of chauvinism. Ostrom's graduated sanctions for commons management can escalate from shaming to a tariff, call it a border tax or a carbon adjustment, levied against imported goods in proportion to the carbon emitted in their production. Now, tough sanctions will bring complaints of injustice. Why should India, which is so poor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? The solution is to recognize that the appropriate target for commons management rules is not the total national emissions, which is how it's currently framed in the Paris Agreement and so forth, and follows from making nation states the parties here. The actual target is emissions where they actually happen. What we need to restrain is not the United States or India so much as the top emitters, the wealthy in corporations in the United States and the top ones in India. Globally, the carbon emissions of the richest 1% are more than double the emissions of the entire poorest half of humanity. And this maps similarly within each country. This shifts the focus from relations between nations to inequality and justice within nations. The climate fight is a fight for justice. So at the same time we press the state to act on climate, we need to press within the state for equality. So finally, mobilizing citizens, democracy. There is another thing besides nationalism for which hundreds of millions of people have been willing to make sacrifices, something for which many have indeed sacrificed their lives. Freedom, liberty, democracy. But as climate disruption increases, we will be reminded of the conventional wisdom that threats to security bring threats to democracy. We saw this in the Cold War, after 9/11, increases of government surveillance, suppression of dissent, conceding power to charismatic leaders, acceptance of violence, and even torture. We expect much more strength as we reach 2 degrees and beyond, and therefore climate change is a grave threat to democracy. We need to get citizens to understand that climate change is a threat to democracy itself, and recognizing the threat to democracy can be combined with nationalism, at least in countries like the United States and, let's say, France, where the idea of the nation incorporates ideals of liberty and equality. Together, these can unite citizens of almost every political persuasion to a joint effort. Now, the chief obstacle to taking serious action on climate is the power of super-rich individuals and giant corporations, and in general, elites who imagine they can survive and even profit from climate disasters. This is another way that inequality is at the core of the climate problem. So the fight for more equality, equal civil rights, justice, for democracy is actually part of the climate fight. Indeed, preserving the climate and preserving democracy are inseparable. You cannot preserve one and not preserve the other. Now, this is not just a domestic matter. I have argued that Republican norms are essential for successfully managing the global commons. A world dominated by authoritarian governments that habitually use force, a world of domineering elites, would be a world of free riders and rent seekers plunging into chaos. Democratic nation states with Republican political culture are essential to coordinate global commons management. Now, coming towards the conclusion, I need to tell you a little more about physics. Climate science, to be honest, is highly uncertain. Even this 1 watt per meter squared is uncertain by about 20%. Scientists find a wide range of what can happen. Without vigorous action now, we are told we will get 3 degrees of global warming by 2090, but in fact, that is only if it turns out we are in the better half of the range of possibilities. Equally likely, unless we act strongly, is 4 degrees of warming, which would be a true hellscape. It would be difficult to maintain an advanced civilization. Never mind, there might be no democracies, there might be no coherent nation states at all. This is the next picture by Thomas Cole in the series after the end of empire. And that's what we get if we don't, that's what we get if we don't have really bad luck. If we have really bad luck, well, anywhere above 2 degrees, there is a significant risk of triggering uncontrollable feedbacks. Emissions of methane from tundra, for example, are self-sustaining, leading to a further warming to 5 degrees or even 6 degrees in the following century. There's a chance, maybe 1% chance, 10% chance, nobody knows, a chance that there may be no region on the planet where any group of humans can survive. So my final section is survival in the most fundamental sense. What is the meaning of your life if the future does not exist? Even those indifferent to patriotism and liberty must quail at the doom of civilization, perhaps of intelligent life in this corner of the universe. The threat to the survival of, well, everything is unthinkable. It's literally unthinkable. It won't fit in normal politics. So we need to start within the familiar framework of nation and democracy. Keep patriotism and justice at the center, but where appropriate, we can expand to include everything else we cherish, our heritage, the posterity, the preservation of our countryside, the survival of anything at all. But we have to do this within this decade, or we'll be too late. The policy decisions we make in the next 10 years will determine the planet's climate for the next 10,000 years. This is the consensus of the world's climate experts, and I say consensus advisedly because they've been instructed they can only say things that they agree upon by consensus. This is the consensus. If we don't change direction, and that means really big changes that put policies in place, we'll have global emissions moving not up as they are now, but sharply downward. Already by 2030, we are committed to a 3-degree world if we are lucky. This places a responsibility on us. We can't say, oh, youth will take care of it. Too late. We've waited too long. We have to do it now. The people who are making policy decisions now, that is to say us, are responsible for the entire fate of human civilization on the planet. This of course, I realize this sounds crazy. Nobody can imagine such responsibility. Have we become the protagonists of a science fiction movie? And yet it is not fiction. This is physics. So I will leave you there.
All right, thank you so much, Spencer, for that stimulating talk. We have been joined by Cutler Cleveland, who will provide some commentary to Spencer's talk. Good to see you, Cutler. Thank you so much. Floor over to you.
Great, thanks, Michael. And Spencer, nice to connect with you again. It's been a while. Thanks for that thought-provoking discussion. Great to join this, be a part of this great series. So I'd like to structure this around in the following way. We have another 25 minutes or so. We have some questions popping up in the chat, and I would encourage folks to queue up some more questions by dumping them into the chat window, and I will navigate through those. I'd like to begin with just a couple of remarks and on a few aspects that Spencer mentioned that are related to the general principles of what he was talking about in my particular area of interest, which is climate change and cities, and how that is all connected to this notion of global democracy, and pulling on a couple of the threads that you talked about, Spencer. And also bringing COVID into it, because I'm jumping ahead. I'm really interested to hear how you think that is, whether this is a temporary, a blip, more than a blip, obviously, in terms of its impact, but how that plays into this this global governance challenge we face and how it connects to climate change. And I'll end with a couple of questions for you, Spencer, and then we can then transition into questions from the other folks on the webinar. So I've been doing a lot of work recently on city decarbonization, and we did some deep work with the city of Boston on what it actually takes to make a major city carbon neutral. So cities around the world are making these, and states are making these grand pledges to become carbon neutral in very aggressive timeframes. And yet very few cities or states have really looked into what does it actually mean on the ground. You know, how do you get fossil fuels out of a city such as Boston, where, you know, 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions in Boston and other cold weather cities is in buildings, are in buildings. City has 100,000 buildings. A good share of them were built before 1950. And they're all most of them are heated by natural gas and fuel oil. So how does one do this? How does one, you know, get people out of the hundreds of thousands of trips that are made into the city every day and internal combustion engine vehicles? And how do you do this in a way that doesn't, at a minimum, worsen inequity and hopefully improve social equity outcomes? So that's the sort of backdrop that I'm looking at this. And we've just recently finished a project which has been looking at cities across the US and talking to climate officials in city halls and asking how the pandemic and ensuing recession has affected climate action. Are people committed to maintaining climate action in the face of the great challenges that they face due to the pandemic? So in terms of one of the questions that I've been thinking a lot about, Spencer, is the role, climate change before the pandemic. A lot of it was focused on the UN and climate negotiations and who was in, who wasn't out. But I've been impressed, not in a good way, but by how little, at least in the US, people have been talking about that. You know, the UN, where's the UN? In all the, you know, they've kind of, in some ways, fallen off the radar in terms of their central role, at least in the US, in climate discussions. But what's really happened in the US is bottom-up action. And so there's been very aggressive action by cities and states in addressing climate change. And the fact that we've gone backwards at the federal level, it's not irrelevant, but all the action and the driving force is from the bottom up, and from a policy perspective. And the real driver is the market and technical innovation. In many places in the US, wind and solar are just cheaper than fossil fuel power generation due to technical innovation and lowering the cost of wind and solar. So the market is driving the decarbonization. And long-term battery storage is going to be quick to follow. And so while federal action is not irrelevant, really at this local action at city and state level, and even regional action, which is now popping up, and market forces are driving decisions. And you see this in the stock performance of renewable energy companies relative to fossil fuel companies. They've weathered the pandemic much better than fossil fuel stocks. The money is flowing to clean energy, even with no help, negative help from Washington. So I'd like to hear, so that's one sort of question for you, Spencer, and I'd like to hear other people talk about it. How does your discussion of the nation state and the need for this sort of collective action in a global commons kind of sense jive with what we see happening in the world? And
should I jump in here and answer
let me pose one more question.
Talk about more? What would you prefer?
Yeah, let me pose one more question, which connects to COVID, and then I'll let you.
Okay.
I'll let you answer, and then we can go back and forth on that perhaps, and then pull in some other questions. Some other great questions are piloted. So the other issue is COVID, and we've done a lot of work at the city level recently looking at how this has impacted city climate action. And I'm wondering how you view, how you think the response to the pandemic and the impact that it has had on people's psyche, markets, technology, in the short run and in the longer run is going to change the dynamic, both at the city and state level and at the national and international level on climate change. You know, one of the things that we've seen from our discussions with city climate officials is that they see this as an opportunity to weave concerns about public health and equity into a climate narrative. And of course, as you know, there are lots of synergies between climate change, public health, clean energy, things that cities can do or states can do that have win-win opportunities. So energy efficiency helps you meet your carbon neutrality goals, but it also improves indoor air quality, thermal comfort, which improves health outcomes, which reduces further risks to, you know, pandemics in the future. So there are all these things you can do which produce gains across multiple fronts. But you have to put equity as a front and center priority, not as a co-benefit that we meet carbon goals, and we also improve equity outcomes. And cities and states are viewing this as an opportunity to elevate and integrate equity issues into climate action. So I guess the two issues or questions are, you know, what's the tension or opportunity to leverage this bottom-up action and the driving force of lowering the price of clean energy in the context of this national and international narrative that you talked about, and then the impact of COVID and how you see that impacting these issues.
Okay, first of all, of course, this is all different from what I was talking about, but I welcome the opportunity to talk about the question of what we should be doing now. Actually, here in Hastings-on-Hudson, I'm a member of a commission. It's a very progressive community, and we are working hard to get our emissions down for the matter of buildings, for example. What our next job, and it's a big haul, is to get the major commercial buildings to start benchmarking their energy use. First, of course, you have to measure it, and then once you measure it, you can start taking efforts to bring it down. So this is the bottom-up thing, and I entirely agree. Most of the action will and has to be, especially in a country like the United States, which is so where power is so diffused, has to be on the local level. Can we succeed? No, we will not get down to zero emissions as we like. It's extremely difficult. We can hope that we will be saved by technology, as the speaker mentioned earlier. Maybe we will be able to find a way to take carbon out of the atmosphere at an affordable thing, and maybe we will do so. It's not terribly likely. We have to stick with Gramsci's famous thing, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. If we do nothing except keep the emissions down low enough so that we don't hit 6 degrees and exterminate ourselves, then that is a win, okay? And anything beyond that is a greater win. And of course, I agree, this must come from bottom line. This wasn't what I'm talking about. I was talking about how you manage things on the international level, but I agree it's very important. I also agree that market action is going to be essential. Batteries, again, we have to hope for technological miracle. There may, in fact, be fundamental limits on what we can do with batteries, in which case, since you can't really build up more than about 50% from wind or solar, otherwise you're building so many things just to take care of the peak usage, you know, and the winter peak or the summer peak, depending on where you are, that it becomes hideously expensive. So you either need the magic of a technological solution for batteries, which you don't have, or use nuclear power, which we do have now. And it's quite true, as someone said earlier, that we may be able to make do with the wonderful reactors that are coming along in the future. But right now, the American industry has failed to be able to build reactors on time and on budget, but the South Koreans are going to be able to mass produce them. And we just buy them from South Korea. And the American public have said they'll be happy to accept reactors if it makes their electricity cheaper. In spite of all the things, if you make electricity cheap enough, people will take nuclear reactors. So That's just to answer a couple of the things that you brought up. In terms of the coronavirus effect, let me start on the pessimistic side. What people should recognize is that when there is a widespread infectious diseases, it raises deep psychological things which have to do with pollution and disease, which are naturally tend towards tribalism and xenophobia. This is an instinct that goes back probably to pre-vertebrate psychology. Okay, it's very deep in our brain. Okay, pollution and disease means stay away from people. So we're going to have that problem, and let's just face this is going to be a problem both in foreign affairs and in the internal tribalism. It's already emerging. So people don't recognize that, but it's a very fundamental force and it's there. On the other hand, as you and many others have pointed out, coronavirus does give us an opportunity. It has shown that people will change their behaviors overnight. We're not sure how permanently, there's a question about that, but it does show that people can change their behaviors, including very important economic behaviors like whether they drive to work. And some of these changes will be permanent. The second thing, which you didn't quite explicitly address, but which we actually did mention it, that it changes people's attitudes towards science. So all of a sudden people say, oh, I do want to hear what the doctors say. Actually, the doctors have fumbled a bit with their early saying, their disagreements and so forth. So it's actually undermined things a bit. And yet people do have some recognition that there is a reality here that experts understand, and that may penetrate. And finally, what you alluded to, but I think is very important, is that the coronavirus has to be answered by stimulus, trillions of dollars of stimulus, and much of that can, and the intention with the things like the Green New Deal, is to divert as much as possible that to climate change. The fact of the matter is that right now the world is subsidizing the use of fossil fuels to the tune of about $5 trillion a year, and that solving the climate problem will cost $2 or $3 trillion a year. So we can solve it for free if we just find the political will, which basically means defeating the elites and the corporations that have a short-sighted view of what should be done. So, okay, so now let's throw the floor open.
Yeah, no, that's your last point is a good segue into a question from one of our colleagues who explicitly labeled it as a devil's advocate position. And basically, the gist is that democracies, and I would add to it sort of neoliberalism, the reliance on markets to make decisions, are inherently have very, very short discount rates. And so they end up, they're focused on short-term outcomes, especially the re-election of themselves to power. And so couldn't one argue that democracies are the worst possible form of government to address long-term challenges like climate change? And why not hand power over to a small group of scientists and other experts and give them the power to issue mandates and implement wise energy choices?
Well, yeah, there's always been an argument that way. It goes way back, and of course, the Chinese government at present looks like it's moving in that direction. The Chinese government, it's been organized in the last 20 or 30 years that engineers and so forth are the people who rise to the top, and they seem to get it, and so they have been acting on climate change and so forth in the way I think they do. Of course, the only problem with autocracies is that because of the way that they are used to behaving, they're not stable in that sense. They may fall. It remains to be seen what's going to happen with Xi and his dictatorship. We remember what happened to Mao and his dictatorship and Stalin and his dictatorship. So you may get short-term advantages by turning things over to experts, which basically means an authoritarian government because there's somebody who has to say, you must obey these experts. There may be short-term advantages, but I don't think they really take a long-term view. Their actual long-term view is simply to preserve themselves in power. Now, that's the long-term view of democratic leaders also, but they don't have the ability to mobilize unlimited force to do it. So it sounds good, but it's actually a short-term solution to turn things over to experts in an authoritarian fashion.
Okay, thanks for that. Here's another question that connects to a major theme of your talk. And the question is posed in the following way, that the rich do not want a climate catastrophe for their children. The problem isn't the rich, it's dysfunctional global governance. 193 sovereign nations negotiated in their narrow national interest arrive at lowest common denominator solutions that are toothless and ineffective. The solution is global democracy. Thoughts?
Well, global democracy would be great, but I can't agree that the rich have behaved well in these circumstances. The reason we are not 20 years ahead, 20 years ago, the 30 years, 1988, the scientists assembled in Montreal and said we want the nations to start making plans to reduce their greenhouse emissions by the year 2000. The things should be trending downward. So we're 30 years behind the curve, and the reason is because very rich people like the Koch brothers and very rich corporations like Exxon, but many others. I mean, even the even the railroads gave money to fight against belief in global warming because railroads carry a lot of coal. So they have proven themselves very short-sighted. The rich people, as rich people, aren't worried about their grandchildren. The grandchildren are going to inherit $1 billion. They imagine they're going to be able to go off on an island somewhere. We're talking about the really rich people, okay? We're talking about the really rich people who control by far the majority of the effective world resources. And we're talking about the really rich corporations, not just all corporations. And they have proven themselves extremely short-sighted in terms of the common good, and in fact, incapable of accepting the common good.
A number of people have picked up on your carbon border tax, which is an intriguing idea. And I believe the EU has talked about doing that and plans to do it. At least they're in some phase of doing that. Could you say more about it and how the idea originated and where we might see it first?
It's an old idea, and it follows from the simple fact that the European Union has been able to reduce its emissions in a seemingly admirable way just by outsourcing them. They send the manufacturers off to China, and the Chinese make the emissions and then ship the goods back to Europe. Same thing happens in agriculture, by the way. So goods in general. So the idea is to rectify this by imposing a carbon border tax so that the emissions, so that everybody pays for the emissions that they're responsible for, whether it's by manufacturing or just by buying the goods. And this not only, gets the emitting nations to straighten out in order to lower their tariffs, but it also makes for a more efficient thing. If you have a big carbon tax on some country that is chopping down its forests to make agriculture, and you bring the agriculture home, that not only brings jobs home, but because you're having presumably a carbon tax at home, then your domestic production is going to be more efficient. So it's just a win-win all around. It's the, this is the theoretical economic solution that basically all economists agree on, is impose a carbon tax, and then to avoid just driving your emissions overseas, just outsourcing your emissions, you have to have a carbon border tax so that everybody is on the equal basis. You don't even have to impose a carbon tax on the Indians, you just impose a big border tax on them and let them worry about how to fix it.
So of course, here in the United States, running on a tax platform is, let's just say it's not a particularly viable political solution. So could you connect that specific policy instrument, a tax, which I agree, I think most economists do argue that internalizing that external cost from an economic perspective is the most efficient way to deal with this problem. But how does that connect to these broader themes about the nation state and global governance to actually
people accepted taxes in the Second World War. The rich accepted confiscatory taxes. They didn't like it, but they had to do it because everyone agreed if it's a question of national survival, and this is a question of national survival, also the survival of everything else, but it's a question of national survival, then people will pay taxes. You have to mobilize that spirit.
I very quickly want to echo what John Vlasto has said on the comment line about carbon tax, and something that we talked about yesterday, and I think it'll come up again when we have the panel on cosmopolitan democracy. The power of states has been limited forever on their power to collect revenue, right? You know, that if people can put their money out of the reach of any authority, whether it's a tribal chief or a city state or a nation state, they do. And given that capital's been very, very mobile since the 1970s at least, right? And we're still on this nation state paradigm, you know, it's a problem, right? I mean, it's, we grow up with public schools that are starving because they don't have the money they need. You know, it's like, well, if you raise taxes, the rich will just put their money somewhere else. And that really forces the issue of, you know, the possibility of, you know, UN Parliamentary Assembly with maybe just the minimal remit to enforce and collect a global tax on carbon and decide how to spend it. And just spend it on stuff that we would all like, you know, like better transportation infrastructure. That idea of a minimalist world parliament is something that, you know, Grenville Clark and others tried to advance to deal with nuclear weapons. It's a tough sell, but it's at least, I just want to put it out there on the table because we talked about it. I actually, though, really love the emphasis on carbon border taxes that Spencer, that you made central to your talk. And I really hope that the EU can do it, because what's the market that the EU governs? What's the population? It's about close to 500 million, isn't it? Is it
Must be,
400?
you know, I'm not sure, maybe 400 million, a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's over 400 million people, right? So you control and access to a market like that, and you change the behavior of very wealthy people and very powerful corporations. And the EU did it with data privacy, where every website you go to anywhere in the world now tells you about cookies, you know. And I think that they can have a real impact on, you know, if they did a carbon tax, boy, I'd love it. You know, if they did a border tax, a tariff on carbon emissions, I would love it. And I'll yield the floor now.
Yeah, well, you know, late in World War II, in 1944, Switzerland was still selling stuff to the Germans, but by this time the Allies had up against the border of Switzerland, and they told Switzerland, we're going to cut off your food supply unless you stop selling stuff to Germans. So at some point you have to play hardball, and the democracies are going to have to get together and play hardball against the tax havens of the rich. Now, can they do it? Yes, they can. Will they do it? I don't know. It's going to be a big haul. Probably what's going to happen, and I don't recall the name of the guy who wrote the book on this, but on about what makes for really big changes in inequality. As we know from Piketty, inequality tends to increase. The only thing that can stop it is something like World War II or the Black Death. The coronavirus doesn't seem to be a big enough disaster to do it, but climate will be a big enough disaster. So there will be a time when the disaster is so great that there will be a window for really massive political changes. Now, by this time, it will be too late to stop at a 3-degree world, but we can sort of the last desperate recourse for optimism of the will is that things will get so really bad that we'll be able to stop short of the 6-degree catastrophe. That's if we have luck with the physics. So that's at least a possibility for the kind of future we may not look forward to, but that is one of the possibilities for the future. The other possibility, of course, is that people act rationally and start reining in this enormous loss of, I don't know what it is, a quarter of the potential government revenue or whatever it is to a few extremely wealthy individuals. That requires people to be rational, and sometimes people do act rationally to everyone's surprise.
Thanks, Spencer. Well, that brings us to 10 o'clock. Thanks for that thought-provoking discussion, for the great questions from our colleagues.